Hello there. Just wanted to share a glass of festive fizz today. So the wine I'm tasting is from Marlborough, it's from Cloudy Bay, and this is their Pelorus non-vintage Brut. Now Cloudy Bay I've covered in some detail previously, but just to sort of run back over its background and history, the estate was founded as recently as 1985, so it's just celebrated 40 years, by an Australian called David Hoonan, a winemaker who'd originally set up the Cape Montelle winery in Margaret River in Western Australia. And I think one of the keys to the success of Cloudy Bay was actually the team that Hoonan put together, the people he got involved in making his wines. So I've mentioned Kevin Judd, the long-term winemaker at Cloudy Bay. I've also mentioned the association with Ivan Sutherland, who was viticulturist there for a very long period. Kevin, the founder and owner of Greywacke, and Ivan, a co-founder of Dog Point. I've already made videos covering Cloudy Bay's Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir. They do also make Chardonnay, and of course both this white and a rosé version of the Pelorus sparkling wine. And the idea to make sparkling wine came very soon after the first vintage here. In fact, the first vintage in which they made sparkling wine was 1987. And the person that David Hoonan got to advise and to help him with the production of a sparkling wine was an American called Harold Osborne. And Harold is very well known for making traditional method sparkling wines in the United States, primarily at the very well-known Schramsberg estate. So the vision was simple. It was to apply the Methode Traditionnelle, the method by which champagne is made, to Marlborough fruit to create a high-quality yet individualistic wine. And the name Pelorus relates to the story of a dolphin that evidently used to welcome ships into the Marlborough Sounds. And that was called Pelorus Jack. So hence the name Pelorus for the sparkling wine. And you do see on the top of the foil of this particular wine a logo of a stylised dolphin. Producing sparkling wine in Marlborough in 1987 was a relatively new thing. The first Methode Traditionnelle sparkling wine that had been made here had been made by Daniel and Adele Lebrun, and they released a non-vintage cuvée in 1985, just a couple of years prior to the first production of sparkling wine at Cloudy Bay. And it's noticeable that very quickly the champagne house Veuve Ciicquot must have noticed what was going on, because it was in 1990 that they made an investment in Cloudy Bay, enabling Cloudy Bay to buy and to plant the widow's vineyard, named in honour of Nicole Barbe-Ponsedin, the widow Ciicquot. And 13 years later, Veuve Ciicquot actually bought out the entire of the rest of David Hoonan's holding in Cloudy Bay, bringing this relatively small New Zealand winery into the luxury goods stable of Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, a move that somewhat supercharged Cloudy Bay's distribution. And not surprisingly today, their wines are found for sale in no less than 30 countries worldwide. Now, there's a fair amount of the detail about Pelorus is left fairly vague in the notes that are left, I guess possibly because this is a non-vintage wine, and some of those details may change from year to year. For instance, we're told that several different clones of both Chardonnay and Pinot Noir are used to produce base wines for this wine, but none of those clones are named in the literature that I've seen from Cloudy Bay. And to be fair, this fruit is sourced from both their own vineyards and also from growers. They don't define the vineyards that the fruit for this wine comes from particularly closely. I mean, they do say that they're located within the Wairau Valley, but then that depends on how broadly you define the Wairau Valley. Some definitions of the Wairau Valley can include some of the southern valleys, such as Brancott and Renwick. And they say that the soil types vary from sort of stony, free-draining soils, so that would be typical of the soils of the central Wairau Valley. But then they say others of the soils are fine silts and contain some clays, which would be more typical of the southern valleys. As I mentioned, for others of Cloudy Bay's wines, vine training using vertical shoot positioning, so trying to get a tall, thin hedge that allows sunlight to penetrate right into the canopy so that all the leaves are photosynthesizing and the fruit isn't being shaded. But yes, predominantly fruit comes from vineyards that are close to the winery. They're on relatively warm, stony soils, and the winemakers are looking to achieve a balance between flavour, ripeness and acidity in the base wines. Now, both Chardonnay and Pinot Noir are hand-picked, and this is done at sugar levels that are listed as being between 18.5 and 20.5 brix. At the winery, all the grapes are whole bunch pressed, and that should be giving quite clean juice. That juice is then clarified by letting it settle for 48 hours. with the clean juice being racked off the solids that are left in the tank. Now, fermentation is inoculated. They use what they define as a pure strain of Montrachet yeast. Now, the most recent notes I've seen say that all the base wines are fermented in stainless steel. Some older notes refer to the idea that a portion of the base wine might have been fermented in oak. So my assumption is therefore that they've moved away from doing that. Notes also make clear that the wine undergoes malolactic conversion, and it does that in the stainless steel tanks where fermentation has occurred. Now, the older notes I saw suggested that malolactic conversion occurred spontaneously using indigenous bacteria that had come into the winery on the fruit. The more recent notes I've seen don't say anything about whether the malolactic conversion uses indigenous bacteria or not. Now, prior to being bottled and put through second fermentation, the wines are left in tank on their lees up until September, when blending will occur. And these lees are stirred up occasionally to help build some richness, roundness and texture in the wine. Now, prior to blending, some of the lots of base wines will be separated to go to become future reserve wines. At the same time, a proportion of older reserve wines will also be added to the blend to add some additional complexity, some of the nuttier, richer flavours that you'll find in the wine. So the wine is blended, it's cold stabilised to ensure that its tartrates won't drop out. I understand the blend that's arrived at is predominantly Chardonnay. Some of the notes I've seen suggest that normally this wine is about 60% of Chardonnay to 40% of Pinot Noir, but the more recent notes are slightly more vague on that. The wine is then bottled with a small amount of sugar and a measured amount of a type of yeast called Prise de Mousse, which is often favoured by champagne producers because it's quite neutral, relatively vigorous, and therefore can be relied on to complete the second fermentation in the bottle and produce the sparkle. The wine then ages in bottle for a further 2 years with the yeasts that have done the second fermentation in the bottle, having died and remaining in the bottle, breaking down slowly, adding richness and complexity to the wine, but also affecting the surface tension and ensuring that smaller bubbles are released from the wine when you open the bottle. After this minimum of 2 years, the wine undergoes a process of degorgement, where the yeasts are brought by riddling to the top of the bottle. The bottle's inverted, that top end is frozen, and the bottle is opened quickly to expel that plug of dead yeast. It's then topped up. It's given a dosage that will bring the sweetness level up to 7 grams per litre of sugar. So it can still be called brut, dry, but just to give the wine some balance with the quite high acidity that a sparkling wine will have. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? I've been talking for a while, and yet it's still bubbling away. There's still a fine bead of really quite tiny pinprick bubbles coming from the centre of my glass up there. Looking at it, the wine has a quite lively, pale, lemon yellow, maybe almost a greenish hint there. Give it a bit of a swirl. I don't really need to because it's a sparkling wine. It's expelling its aromas anyway. And the aromas, there's some quite nice intensity. Initially of lovely lemony aromas. That's then supported by yeasty notes, some toasty touches. And there's a sort of a mineral purity sitting there in those aromas. It's hard to define. Smelling again, the second look at the aromas, I'm seeing more of that toastiness, more of that sort of yeasty, almost a warm, brioche, appealing sort of notes. The aromas are quite complex and they're quite attractive. So let's have a taste. On the palate, there's good acidity. Now, I've said the dosage included sugar to bring this up to 7 grams per litre. The wine doesn't taste sweet because that sugar is being balanced by crisp acidity. The acid has quite a sort of a lemony note, and actually sort of sitting behind the sharp citric note, there's the beginnings of some sort of hints of lemon meringue pie. As those flavours have started developing, then the flavours move on. There's more of a sort of a yeasty, biscuity, bready note. Lovely acidity is giving freshness, it's ensuring my mouth's watering, and for that reason I'd suggest this is a lovely aperitif. This really is a wine to wake up your taste buds and leave your mouth watering. Those sort of citric lemon meringue pie notes on the front of the palate are lasting quite well, but the finish is almost a sort of a mineral purity, almost as if I'm getting a hint of crushed seashell. There's a really nicely, purely defined finish. There's good acidity here and lovely freshness. Now, the Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this wine marks it at 90 out of 100. I think that's a very reasonable score. I like the sort of the lemony notes and the mineral notes here and the way they combine. I might have scored it, say, a 91 myself, but actually I think 90 is about fair. In terms of the wine's quality, I think it's fair to say that this is a really well-made Methode Traditionnelle. It has a really fine bead, and that's given a lovely soft mousse that's supported a beautiful, elegant, lemony, Chardonnay-dominated fruit. It hasn't quite had the breadth or the richness of a more Pinot Noir-dominated sort of style. And as a result, there is this long, clean, elegant finish. I think it's a wine that makes a really nice aperitif. Also, I'd suggest that if you're thinking of purchasing it, if you have the ability to buy a few bottles and keep them in your cellar for 6 months to a year, maybe even 2 years, I think some of the reactions that go on in the bottle will start to emphasise those lovely sort of lemon meringue pie notes that sort of can become a little more candied peel-like as the wine ages in bottle. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope that you've enjoyed the tasting, and thank you also so much for joining me throughout the year since May when I started making these videos. If you have enjoyed this video, do please press the like button. If you're enjoying all the videos, it would be great if you could subscribe and support the channel in that way. It makes a huge difference to have your membership, and it doesn't cost you anything. If you have friends you think might like to watch the video, please feel free to pass it on to them. And if you have any comments, as so many of you have throughout the year on the various wines I've looked at, the tastings I've been doing, and a host of other related matters, do please feel free to drop them in the comments box below. I love hearing what you think about the wines, the tastings, and everything else related to them. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope that you'll be able to join me again very soon for another tasting. Until then, bye for now.